What's up everybody, blessed be, my name is Manon and you are watching Witch in the Working, where we will be discussing all things witchy in and around, throughout and about, above, below, and beyond. This video offers my personal views on the topic at hand. Please visit me on my other platforms as well, including Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon, all linked down in the description below. The full script of this video and most of the others is available on my Patreon account for download if desired, to build your Witch in the Working Book of Shadows. Do you need help with a spell or fancy a tarot reading? Shoot on over to my store Bewitching and Bizarre, linked down in the description below for your personalized working and or reading. So when I was a young up and coming witch, I was visiting with my high priestess Debola up in her Carolina mountain cabin one summer with a few other coven members. She had a book there called the Pickingill Papers. This book was all about a man named George Pickingill and his journeys through witchcraft and how he influenced Gerald Gardner's craft, which ultimately influenced our craft world we have today. This book intrigued me and floored me as it gave me solidity and confirmation of the Gardnerian craft I was working with. This book, though not proven to be factual, expressed how Pickingill had 9 covens, and from his covens is where Gardnerian craft was born. Again, this is not proven by any means, but it definitely piqued my interest, and to this day I always teach and introduce my covens to George Pickingill. So now I pass him on to you. Roll intro. Welcome back everybody. Imagine living in a small quiet village in the English countryside during the 1800s. The air smells of freshly cut hay and the chatter of townsfolk fills the market square as they sell eggs, wool, and gossip. In this world where science and superstition often collide, stories of mysterious individuals swirl through every community. These figures, called cunning folk, are the local healers, spellcasters, and problem solvers, bridging the gap between the everyday and the magical. One such figure was George Pickingill, a name whispered with a mix of awe and suspicion. George Pickingill wasn't your typical villager. He lived in the county of Essex, a region steeped in folklore and superstition. Born around 1816, Pickingill worked as a farm laborer, a tough job that kept him connected to the rhythms of nature. But what set him apart from his neighbors was his reputation as a cunning man, a person who could perform magic to heal, protect, or even curse. At a time when modern medicine was limited and life's challenges often felt overwhelming, people turned to cunning folk like Pickingill for help. Though the details of Pickingill's life are murky, we know he became a fascinating larger-than-life figure in his community. He was described as a tall man with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through people. His demeanor was commanding and villagers both respected and feared him. Some claimed he could summon spirits or control animals with a mere glance, while others swore he had uncanny knowledge of things no one had told him. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, they added to his mysterious aura. One of the most intriguing things about Pickingill was his connection to nature. He knew the secrets of plants and herbs, using them to make potions and remedies for illnesses or injuries. Imagine living in a time when even a simple infection can be deadly. For many villagers, Pickingill's herbal remedies were a lifeline. His deep understanding of the natural world made him seem almost otherworldly, as if he had access to knowledge beyond what ordinary people could comprehend. But Pickingill's reputation didn't end with healing. Some villagers whispered that he could cast spells to protect crops, livestock, and homes. In an agricultural society where a failed harvest could mean starvation, this kind of magic was highly valued. Others, however, claimed he could also curse those who crossed him. These darker tales made Pickingill a figure of caution as much as admiration. Whether he truly had such powers or whether these stories were fueled by fear of the unknown is still up for debate. What makes Pickingill's stories so captivating is the mix of fact and folklore. On one hand, he was a cunning man, a role deeply rooted in English tradition. Cunning folk were practical magicians who helped their communities with everything from finding lost objects to breaking curses. On the other hand, Pickingill's legends seem to go beyond the usual tales of cunning folk. Some say he had ties to ancient magical traditions, while others suggest he was one of the earliest influencers of modern witchcraft. These claims are part of what keeps his story alive and hotly debated even today. It's important to understand the world in which Pickingill lived to fully appreciate appreciate his story. In the 19th century, England was undergoing massive changes. The Industrial Revolution was transforming cities and towns, but in rural areas like Essex, life still revolved around the land and old traditions. Superstitions were part of everyday life, and people often sought explanations for misfortune in the supernatural. This cultural backdrop allowed figures like Pickingill to thrive as they offered solutions and a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Interestingly, Pickingill's reputation extended beyond this village. Some stories suggest that witches from other parts of England sought him out for his knowledge and advice. This has led to speculation that he might have been involved in organizing or influencing secret magical groups. While these claims are hard to verify, they add another layer of intrigue to his life. George Pickingill's story is not just about one man. It's about the enduring power of folklore and the human desire to believe in something greater than ourselves. Whether he was a healer, a magician, or simply a man who understood the fears and hopes of his community, Pickingill represents a bridge between the mundane and the mystical. His life reminds us that magic isn't always about wands and potions. It's often about the ways we seek to understand and influence the world around us. Picture yourself living in a time when your closest doctor to walk to might be miles away or not exist at all. In your village, the answer to life's unexpected challenges isn't a pharmacy or a hospital, but a local figure known for their wisdom and resourcefulness and knack for the unusual. This person is the cunning man or cunning woman, someone who blends practical knowledge with a pinch of the supernatural. George Pickingill was one of these individuals, and his role as a cunning man made him an essential yet mysterious figure in his community. Cunning folk like Pickingill weren't just healers, they were problem solvers. If your cow stopped giving milk, your crops were failing, or you thought your neighbor had cursed you, you'd head to someone like Pickingill for help. In 19th century England, these issues weren't just minor inconveniences. They could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Pickingill's ability to address these concerns made him both respected and indispensable to the villagers of Essex. One of the most fascinating aspects of Pickingill's work was his approach to healing. While modern medicine has advanced significantly, it's important to remember that back then, people relied on remedies passed down through generations. Pickingill had an incredible understanding of herbs, roots, and plants, using them to craft treatments for illnesses and injuries. For example, he might use willow bark, now known to contain a natural form of aspirin, to relieve pain. His remedies weren't just random guesses. They were based on a deep understanding of nature and the body. But Pickingill didn't stop at physical healing. He was known for addressing spiritual and emotional troubles too. Many people believed that illnesses or misfortunes could be caused by negative energies, curses, or other supernatural forces. Pickingill would perform rituals or create charms to protect people from harm or reverse bad luck. These practices tapped into the villagers' belief systems, offering them comfort and hope in challenging times. Whether or not these rituals worked in a literal sense, they often provided a sense of relief that no amount of logic could replace. Another key part of Pickingill's role was his ability to see beyond the surface. Some stories claim he could locate lost objects or animals, almost as if he had a supernatural GPS in his mind. Imagine losing your only goat, a source of milk for your family, and being told Pickingill could help you find it. His success in such matters earned him a reputation as someone with extraordinary gifts, whether those gifts were real or just a product of his keen observational skills. Of course, being a cunning man wasn't always sunshine and roses. Along with admiration came fear. Pickingill's reputation wasn't built solely on his ability to heal and help. Some believed he could also harm. Stories circulated that he could place curses or cast spells against those who wronged him or his clients. In a world where superstition was as strong as faith, even the suggestion of such powers was enough to make people wary of crossing him. This duality, healer and potential harmer, made cunning folk like Pickingill complex figures, simultaneously admired and avoided. Interestingly, Pickingill's role as a cunning man didn't just benefit individuals, it also supported the wider community. Farming was the backbone of rural life in 19th century Essex, and agricultural success depended on forces far beyond anyone's control. If a drought threatened the crops or blight spread amongst livestock, people turned to cunning folk for guidance. Pickingill might perform blessings on the land, create protective charms, or even lead rituals to encourage a bountiful harvest. These practices strengthened the community's bond, giving them a sense of unity and shared purpose in the face of hardship. It's worth noting that Pickingill operated in a time when cunning folk were starting starting to fade from the cultural landscape. As modern science began to take hold and skepticism of folk practices grew, cunning men and women were often dismissed as relics of the past. Yet Pickingill managed to maintain his reputation and influence, a testament to how deeply his work resonated with those around him. People needed someone who could navigate both the natural and the mystical, and Pickingill filled that role perfectly. One of the most intriguing questions about Pickingill is whether his practices were purely practical or if he truly believed in the magical elements of his craft. Some accounts suggest he was deeply connected to the ancient traditions, while others hint that he was simply a clever man who understood the power of perception. Either way, his ability to blend folklore with practical solutions cemented his place as one of Essex's most memorable cunning men. Ultimately, George Pickingill's role as a cunning man wasn't just about providing services. It was about being a beacon of hope in a world full of uncertainties. He was someone who could take the worries and fears of his neighbors and offer them a path forward, whether through a potion, a charm, or a quiet word of advice. His work reminded us that sometimes the most powerful magic is the ability to help others believe in a brighter tomorrow. In the shadowy world of folklore and witchcraft history, few stories are as puzzling and debated as the tales of George Pickingill's 9 covens. While his work as a cunning man is documented in local legends, the idea of Pickingill leading or even organizing 9 secretive covens introduces an entirely new layer of intrigue. Let's explore these mysterious claims, separating whispers of myth from possible truths, and get into how they've influenced the modern perception of witchcraft. The 9 covens are one of the most controversial aspects of Pickingill's legacy. According to some sources, Pickingill wasn't just a solitary cunning man, but a powerful figure within the magical community who oversaw a network of 9 covens across England. These covens were said to be rooted in ancient magical traditions, with practices handed down through generations. While this claim might sound like something out of a fantasy novel, it has sparked serious debate amongst historians and occultists alike. The idea of these covens suggests that Pickingill's influence stretched far beyond the village of Canadon, where he lived. Allegedly, each of the 9 covens had its own members and rituals, but all were connected under Pickingill's guidance. Some stories describe him as a kind of high priest, uniting these groups and preserving their ancient wisdom. If true, this would make him not just a local cunning man, but a key figure in the preservation of pre-modern witchcraft practices. But where did these stories come from? Much of the information about the 9 covens comes from later writers, particularly Charles Cardell, a figure involved in the early 20th century witchcraft revival. Cardell claimed that Pickingill's covens influenced the modern witchcraft movement, including traditions like Gardnerian Wicca. However, critics argue that these claims are impossible to verify and may have been exaggerated or even fabricated for dramatic effect. One reason the 9 covens story remains so intriguing is its connection to secrecy. In Pickingill's time, witchcraft was considered taboo, and practitioners often operated in complete privacy to avoid persecution. This secrecy naturally led to speculation about who was involved and what they were doing. The idea of a network of interconnected covens working behind the scenes adds an air of mystery that continues to captivate imaginations. The practices of these alleged covens are said to have blended elements of folk magic and ceremonial traditions. For example, they may have performed rituals honoring the cycles of nature, casting spells for protection or prosperity, and even communing with spirits. However, it's also suggested that these groups were selective about who could join. Membership could have required not only magical skill, but also an understanding of ancient customs passed down through oral tradition. A particularly fascinating aspect of the 9 covens narrative is the claim that they influenced modern witchcraft. Some believe that Pickingill's teachings, or at least the stories about him, played a role in shaping the traditions revived by figures like Gerald Gardner in the mid-20th century. This connection has led to debates about whether Pickingill should be seen as an ancestor of modern witchcraft or simply a legendary figure whose story was retrofitted into the narrative. Skeptics, however, argue that the 9 covens story may be more myth than fact. There is little historical evidence to confirm that Pickingill led such a network, and many details rely on second-hand accounts written long after his death. Critics point out that stories of secret societies often emerge when historical records are scarce, filling in the gaps with imagination rather than truth. Still, even if the 9 covens were more legend than reality, the story itself has contributed to the mystique of Pickingill and his place in witchcraft history. Another angle to consider is why this legend has endured. The idea of the 9 covens resonates with a deep human fascination for secret knowledge and hidden power. Whether real or fictional, the covens represent the allure of community, mystery, and a shared connection to something ancient and magical. For many, they serve as a reminder that even in a modern, rational world, there's still room for the unexplained. So what do the 9 covens teach us about Pickingill? Whether he truly led them or they are simply part of his mythos, they highlight his role as a figure of influence and mystery. Pickingill's name has become a symbol of the complex relationship between history and folklore, reminding us that sometimes the stories we tell are just as important as the facts we know. As we move forward, it's important to keep an open mind. The 9 covens may never be fully understood, but they invite us to think about how traditions are passed down and how individuals like Pickingill become larger-than-life figures. I've had other Gardnerians approach me and diligently express that I shouldn't teach my coven about George Pickingill because it's all false and hogwash. I simply say, prove it. Is it false, or do you want it to be false for your own egotistical reasons? Because reality is, we just don't know if it is truly all gibberish or not, and I think that's where a lot of the true power lies. George Pickingill may have been an ordinary man in appearance, a farm laborer in rural 19th century England, but the legacy of his magical practices is anything but ordinary. His name echoes through the folklore of witchcraft, shrouded in whispers of extraordinary abilities, secret knowledge, and a connection to ancient traditions. While many cunning folk left behind only small local impressions, Pickingill's reputation grew to something much larger. At the heart of Pickingill's magical legacy is his blend of folk magic and what some have called high magic or ceremonial practices. Folk magic was practical and deeply tied to the rhythms of rural life. It involved charms, remedies, and rituals to solve everyday problems. As I discussed earlier, Pickingill excelled in these practices, crafting potions and spells that addressed everything from sick livestock to family feuds. Yet some stories suggest he delved into more formal and complex magical systems, which would have set him apart from other cunning folk of this time. What's particularly fascinating about Pickingill's alleged practices is how they bridge the gap between local traditions and broader, more esoteric ideas. For example, some accounts claim that he incorporated elements of ceremonial magic, which often involves structured rituals, sacred symbols, and connections to powerful spiritual forces. This kind of magic requires not only skill, but also a deep understanding of ancient texts and traditions, suggesting Pickingill may have had access to knowledge that was rare for a rural farmer. Whether this was through books, oral tradition, or pure ingenuity remains a mystery. One of the most striking claims about Pickingill's magic is his supposed ability to work with spirits. According to some stories, he could summon and control supernatural entities to aid in his workings. This practice, often associated with ceremonial magic, added a sense of awe and fear to his reputation. Villagers might have sought his help in times of need, but many were also wary of getting too close, fearing the powers he was rumored to command. This connection to spirits, whether real or imagined, has become one of the most enduring aspects of his magical legacy. Another key part of Pickingill's story is his understanding of natural cycles and energies. He was said to have performed rituals tied to the changing seasons, aligning his magic with the ebb and flow of nature. This approach resonates with modern practitioners of witchcraft, many of whom continue to celebrate the cycles of the year through the Wheel of the Year. Pickingill's ability to harmonize his practices with natural rhythms reflects a timeless principle of magic, the idea that the natural world and the magical world are deeply interconnected. Pickingill's influence didn't stop with his own community. Stories about his practices and teachings have been linked to the rise of modern witchcraft movements in the 20th century. While some of these connections are speculative, they highlight how Pickingill's reputation extended far beyond his lifetime. For example, it's been suggested that certain rituals attributed to Pickingill influenced figures like Joe Gardner, the founder of Gardnerian Wicca. Whether or not this is true, the idea itself underscores the lasting power of Pickingill's legend. However, like many figures associated with magic, Pickingill's legacy is a mix of admiration and controversy. Some argue that the stories of his advanced magical practices are exaggerated or even entirely fictional, created by later writers to add drama and mystique to his story. Yet, even if parts of his legacy are mythical, they still carry a powerful message about the importance of imagination and belief in shaping history. After all, magic isn't just about what we can prove, it's about how we connect with mystery and possibility. Perhaps one of the most enduring lessons from Pickingill's magical legacy is the importance of adaptability. He seemed to understand that magic wasn't static, but something that could evolve with the needs of the people around him. Whether he was crafting a simple charm or performing a complex ritual, his work reflected a deep understanding of how how to balance tradition with innovation. This flexibility is a hallmark of magical practice, reminding us that the best magic is often a blend of the old and the new. Ultimately, Pickingill's magical legacy is as much about the questions it raises as the answers it provides. Was he truly a master of ceremonial magic, or simply a cunning man whose legend grew with time? Did he influence the modern witchcraft revival, or was he just one of many figures whose stories contributed to the movement? These uncertainties only add to his mystique, inviting us to keep exploring and questioning. George Pickingill may have lived in a small village, but his magical legacy has reached across generations, inspiring both awe and curiosity. Whether he was a genuine magical master or a man whose reputation became larger than life, his story continues to remind us of the enduring power of magic, mystery, and the human imagination. George Pickingill is one of those historical figures whose life feels like it belongs in a movie or a novel, filled with whispers of mystery, magic, and power. But when it comes to the truth about him, things get murky fast. How do we separate what's real from what's been exaggerated, misremembered, or completely made up? First, let's talk about why it's so hard to know the truth about Pickingill. He lived in the 19th century England, long before social media, news archives, or even detailed local records could give us a clear picture of his day-to-day life. Most of what we know comes from stories passed down word of mouth or written by people long after he died. While these tales make for great reading, they're not always reliable. As anyone who's ever played the game telephone knows, stories tend to change and grow with each retelling. One of the biggest challenges in separating fact from fiction is figuring out where these stories came from. Some accounts of Pickingill's life and magical practices come from local folklore shared by villagers who might have added their own dramatic flair to the story. Other details were introduced later by writers and researchers interested in witchcraft. For example, again, Charles Cardell, a mid-20th century writer involved in the revival of modern witchcraft, wrote extensively about Pickingill. While his work helped popularize Pickingill's story, it also raised questions about how much of it was based on fact and how much was embellished. Take, for example, the claims about Pickingill leading the 9 covens. While this idea has become one of the most famous parts of his legend, there is little concrete evidence to support it. Some believe the story was created to link Pickingill to the growing interest in witchcraft during the 20th century, making him seem like a kind of proto-witch who paved the way for modern traditions. Others argue that even if the 9 covens weren't real, the idea reflects the way communities like his might have shared and preserved magical knowledge in secretive ways. Another area where fact and fiction blur is Pickingill's supposed magical powers. Tales of him summoning spirits, cursing his enemies, or even controlling animals make for exciting stories, but they're hard to verify. Was Pickingill truly a master magician with supernatural abilities, or was he simply a clever man who understood how to use people's fears and beliefs to his advantage? The truth might lie somewhere in between. In a time when many people believed in magic, someone with a deep understanding of human behavior and natural remedies could easily gain a reputation as something more than ordinary. Even Pickingill's personality is tricky to pin down. Some accounts describe him as a commanding, almost intimidating figure who inspired both respect and fear. Others portray him as a wise and caring healer, dedicated to helping his community. Which version is true? Perhaps both. Like many historical figures, Pickingill's personality might have been as complex and multifaceted as the stories surrounding him. The way Pickingill's story has been shaped over time says as much about us as it does about him. People are drawn to mystery and magic, and stories like Pickingill's tap into our collective fascination with the unknown. They also reflect how we project our own ideas and hopes onto the past. For those interested in witchcraft, Pickingill represents a connection to an older, more mystical way of life, even if some parts of his story are more symbolic than factual. That doesn't mean we should dismiss everything about Pickingill as myth. Even if certain details have been exaggerated or invented, the fact that his story has survived for so long suggests that it holds some kernel of truth. Maybe it's in the way he represented the cunning folk tradition, or in how he seemed to embody the blending of practical knowledge and magical belief. Whatever the case, Pickingill's story reminds us that history isn't just about facts, it's also about meaning. So how do we approach Pickingill's legacy? The best way might be to think critically but stay open-minded. It's okay to enjoy the more fantastical parts of his story while recognizing that they might not be entirely true. At the same time, we should appreciate what his legend tells us about the culture and beliefs of his time. Pickingill's life, real or imagined, serves as a bridge between history and folklore, inviting us to explore the blurry line between reality and myth. In the end, George Pickingill's story isn't just about who he was, it's about how we remember him. Fact and fiction may be tangled together, but that's what makes his legacy so fascinating. Whether we see him as a historical figure, a larger-than-life legend, or a mix of both, Pickingill continues to inspire curiosity, debate, and a sense of wonder about the world of magic and the people who practice it. George Pickingill may have lived in the 19th century, but his story has left ripples that continue to influence how we think about witchcraft today. Whether or not everything said about him is true, one thing is clear: Pickingill has become an important figure in the history of magic. To understand Pickingill's influence, it's important to look at the time when modern witchcraft as we know it began to emerge. In the mid-20th century, people like J.L. Gardner were shaping Wicca into a formal spiritual path. At the same time, others were researching and reviving older magical traditions, looking for connections to the past. Pickingill's name came up frequently in these conversations, with some claiming he played a direct role in inspiring modern practices. One of the most debated aspects of Pickingill's legacy is the idea that he helped preserve ancient magical knowledge. Some writers have suggested that Pickingill's alleged 9 covens passed down rituals and teachings that later influenced Wicca. For instance, practices like casting a circle, honoring nature, and celebrating the cycles of the year are central to Wicca, and it's easy to imagine how they might have roots in older traditions. While there's no solid evidence tying Pickingill directly to these ideas, his reputation as a cunning man and leader of magical groups has made him an appealing figure for those looking to connect modern witchcraft to a deeper history. What's interesting is how Pickingill's story has been embraced, reimagined, and even challenged by different parts of the witchcraft community. For some, he's a symbol of continuity, proof that magical traditions survived through centuries of secrecy and repression. For others, he's more of a mythic figure, representing the archetype of the cunning folk who blended practical skills with mystical insight. Either way, his story has become a touchstone for discussions about where modern witchcraft comes from and how it relates to the past. Pickingill's influence can also be seen in the way modern witchcraft values a connection to nature and the land. As someone who worked closely with the rhythms of rural life, Pickingill's practices likely reflected a deep respect for the natural world. Today, many witches draw inspiration from nature, whether through herbalism, seasonal rituals, or simply spending time outdoors. While these ideas don't come exclusively from Pickingill, his story highlights how important his connection has always been in magical traditions. Another way Pickingill's legacy has shaped modern witchcraft is through the idea of community. The stories about his leadership of covens, whether real or fictional, emphasize the importance of working together and sharing knowledge. In a time when witches were often isolated or in hiding, the idea of a network of magical practitioners united under a common purpose was powerful. Today, covens and magical communities play a similar role, providing support, learning opportunities, and a sense of belonging. Of course, not everyone agrees on how much influence Pickingill really had. Some historians argue that his story has been exaggerated or even invented by later writers. For example, again, Charles Cardell's accounts of Pickingill's connection to modern witchcraft have been criticized for lacking evidence. Others point out that while Pickingill's story is fascinating, it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Even so, the debates about Pickingill's influence highlight something important. How we tell the story of witchcraft matters. Whether he was a true innovator, a cunning man whose legend grew over time, or a mix of both, Pickingill represents the human desire to connect with something greater than ourselves. His story reminds us that magic is not just about rituals and spells. It's also about imagination, belief, and the way we shape our understanding of the world. In many ways, Pickingill's legacy is less about specific practices and more about the spirit of witchcraft itself. He represents the idea that magic is a living tradition, constantly evolving while staying rooted in the past. For modern witches, this can be a powerful teaching that the path they walk is both ancient and new, shaped by countless individuals who came before them. So why does Pickingill still matter? Because his story challenges us to think critically and creatively about the history, myth, and magic. It invites us to explore the ways people have used witchcraft to understand and influence their lives, from rural villages to modern cities. Whether or not Pickingill was a major influence on Wicca or simply a compelling figure from folklore, his name continues to spark curiosity and conversation, proof that magic of storytelling is just as powerful as any spell. George Pickingill's story is a reminder that history isn't just about what we can prove. It's also about the questions that keep us curious and the stories that spark our imagination. Whether he was a real-life magician with incredible powers, a skilled cunning man whose reputation grew over time, or a mix of facts and folklore, his legacy has left a lasting mark. He represents a time when magic and everyday life were deeply connected, when people turned to nature and community for solutions to their struggles. His tale inspires us to think about how the world might hold more mystery and wonder than we often realize. But Pickingill's story is more than just an exploration of one man's life. It challenges us to see how traditions evolve and how legends shape the way we think about magic today. Whether or not he truly influenced modern witchcraft, his story continues to encourage witches and magical practitioners to honor the past while embracing the present. George Pickingill teaches us that magic isn't just about what we do, it's about how we connect with the world, the people around us, and the stories we choose to carry forward. That's the real magic, and it's something we can all find in our own way. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Witch in the Working. What do you think is the most intriguing part of George Pickingill's story? His role as a cunning man, the mystery of the 9 covens, or his rumored influence on modern witchcraft? Why? Let us all know in the comments below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to ring that little bell to be reminded of the wonderful and exciting future episodes to come. I love you guys and girls. Blessed be.